And we also do like collaborative projects, right? So that we can explore the capabilities of Azure extensively. So how do you get involved? So and I'm sure a number of us in the meetup, in the meeting right now, are not members of the group, because sometimes we post the links on our WhatsApp, LinkedIn, so that you just join the meeting directly. But it's advisable to join the group, because then is where you are going to see any updates in case it's a physical meetup, a virtual meetup. So I'm going to share the link of joining the group on the chat. And also we do have a space, or rather a say, on the LinkedIn platform. I'm also going to share that on the chat, so you can just find us and connect with us on the LinkedIn. We are called the Azure Kenya User Group, or rather that's the handle, Azure Kenya User Group. So ideally, as you join the group, you're going to find meeting updates and topics of discussions in there, so that you can also do your research early before we start the sessions, and also get to interact with the person who's going to do the presentation. And also, again, interact with members who are already in the team, and also network. So last but not least, today's session will be about generative AI, or Gen AI with Azure OpenAI service. And I'm gonna let Tim introduce herself. Let me not kind of give out everything that he does. So we'll let him introduce himself and tell us what he does. And some of us know him from a specific platform. He's gonna tell us the platform that or rather he might assume that we know him from, and then he's gonna like take away the session. So Tim, let me give it back to you.
All right, thanks, Charlene. Let me start my screen share here.
Sure.
Share. Choose what you want to share. There we go. Okay, well, thanks again, Charlene and Samson, especially for accommodating my sometimes volatile time schedule. Thank you all for being here at this updated time. I appreciate you all very much. My name is Tim Warner. I'm a technical trainer and IT pro, been in the industry about 25 years. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, in the southeastern part of USA. I've been associated with Microsoft for that whole 25 years. I've been a trainer for that whole time. I was in the MVP program for a number of years. I was with Microsoft full-time, even working in their Learn organization, doing Azure governance work, policy, taxonomic tags, all that stuff. There's my contact email address, tim-warner@pluralsight.com. I work for Pluralsight mainly to make training courses for them. Excuse me. Let me dump out of the slideshow. I'll also give my contact info at the end. My understanding is that I'll present to you for 40 or 45 minutes on Azure OpenAI platform. And then any questions, comments, concerns, curiosities you have, I will give you a candid result. And if I don't know, I'll tell you and I'll find the answer for you. So this is really totally hands-on. I figured we would jump right into the heart of the matter here. I think there's a couple websites right off the top that you should bookmark in looking at Azure OpenAI service. One would be the Azure OpenAI service documentation itself over at learn.microsoft.com. And in particular, the main page here, what is Azure OpenAI service, is useful because right up at the beginning here in the table of contents, there's a very important question of how do I get access to Azure OpenAI? Maybe you're one of the fortunate ones that see it when you sign into the Azure portal, but maybe not. Unfortunately, the demand is such, and according to Microsoft, what they say in their docs here, their commitment to responsible AI is right now they're working with customers who already have a partnership with Microsoft. So a lot of today, what I'm about to show you, it makes me sad as a technical trainer. You may not be able to get hands-on with quite yet. I hope you do. It'll only be a matter of time. It's just we're early days with all this. Of course, what is this anyway? Well, you might remember back in the fall of last year when OpenAI gave us ChatGPT. It's still around. Another bookmark I think is just as important besides the Azure OpenAI service docs would be the OpenAI platform docs. Why, you might ask? OpenAI, they kind of are, actually. It's a really strange partnership that Microsoft has with OpenAI. OpenAI is the company that trained GPT, the generative pre-trained transformer generative AI model, and Microsoft is adding it via the Copilot ecosystem through just about all of their products. Here I am on Windows 11, and I've got this. I haven't played much with Windows Copilot. I've been experimenting a little bit with it, but it doesn't seem to be much different from what you get with Bing. If you go to Bing Chat at bing.com, what I think was more impressive is if you open up Paint, if you're on a Windows 11 machine and you're up to date with updates, see on the toolbar, there's this co-creator. So we can work with DALL-E, which is the fine-tuned GPT edition that does image generations. We can work with those generations and then add to them right within Paint. So we're going to see this trend get more and more front and center. And the reason why I suggest that you keep your fingers in the pie of OpenAI, if that makes sense, I made a rhyme too, is that they're the leaders. They're the actual architects of the GPT model. And what I've seen over the last several months is a lag, a pretty big lag in functionality between what OpenAI is offering via their APIs and then what's available in Azure and OpenAI service. I was surprised, quite honestly, when I was reading this What is Azure OpenAI service article earlier today, and I noticed that they mentioned the very latest version of GPT, GPT-4 Turbo with Vision. That was just announced by OpenAI at their first conference a few weeks ago, and I was really surprised to see it show up here so soon. So maybe we'll see more momentum over the coming weeks and months within Azure. But if there is somebody in the group today that's not up to speed with generative AI in general, I thought a good way to start would be to just take us into good old ChatGPT. I'm using a personal account and I do have the paid plus tier so I can access GPT-4. And the idea with generative AI is that we provide our prompt or our input to the AI, and that nowadays it can be multimodal. I can upload a file like a data set and have GPT analyze it for me. I can upload an image that has maybe a screenshot of source code and say, can you convert this to editable text? Or traditionally, I can use my voice on my mobile phone, the ChatGPT app. You can communicate entirely with your voice if you want to, or good old text, which I'll do now. I'll say, create a bicep deployment template that creates an Azure OpenAI service instance. So there's our prompt. It's formed into an HTTP request authenticated by my paid account. And GPT over on OpenAI's side, which is hosted in Azure, interestingly enough, is taking that text, converting it into what are called tokens or word fragments. And those word fragments get created into I like to envision it as almost a cloud or a constellation. If you've ever seen back in the 90s with blogs, remember the word clouds, where words that had a higher incidence in a blog were bigger than words that might have just been mentioned once. That's how I envision GPT. So your prompt is converted into this matrix of word fragments that have a relationship. I mean, Microsoft and Azure are more highly correlated, let's say, than Microsoft and Gumball, you know? So that embedding, as it's called, is passed into the larger GPT neural network, which again is a constellation of these little token fragments that have numeric values that determine how close they are in meaning and context. It's really amazing stuff when you start to get deeper in the math of it. But we don't need to worry about that right now. That prompt is interpreted by the model, and it predicts fragment by fragment, token by token, and ultimately word by word, the best response based on what you give it. And that's why prompt engineering is such a big deal now, because the way you phrase your prompt is entirely dependent on the quality of the result that you get back from the AI. So GPT-4 is a multimodal AI. You not only can give it just about any kind of input, but as you see, we get back text, but we also get source code. We can get images back. We can get audio back. GPT is a multimodal generative AI. And remember how we were back in Microsoft Paint? I think I closed it, yeah, but those images that you have DALL-E create, those are yours. OpenAI told me that directly. So if you're thinking about intellectual property, this is generated content. That's why it's called generative AI. So the text that gives you, the source code that it gives you is supposed to be net new and it belongs to you. Same with generated images. And I know it's controversial because we're still early days with this generative AI stuff. There's lawsuits going on all over the place. There's content creators who are really worried about getting ripped off. There are employees who are worried about their jobs disappearing. Quite honestly, last night I thought to myself, you know, as a technical trainer, I can see GPT replacing me someday. And that's a humbling thought, to be sure. So a lot of people in the world, business and otherwise, are using this because it improves your productivity. It can teach you stuff. It can shorten the amount of time it takes to get work done. It can give you new ideas. It can help you improve and refactor your code. It can help you prepare for your next job interview. Really great stuff. Well, what's going on with Azure and Microsoft and that partnership? Won't get into the weeds about the partnership, but we're talking about a long-standing situation where Microsoft and OpenAI are really tightly coupled, but they're also doing their own stuff. OpenAI is selling access to their GPT, all of their different models and APIs separately. And what I tell customers in a consulting context, that one of your first questions is, are you going to want to focus more on consuming the OpenAI APIs where you're getting the latest, the greatest, the vanguard as soon as it's available? But here's real world stuff. I found that the trade-off of diving into the OpenAI APIs is that they're so volatile. OpenAI is moving so fast in their innovation, they're confidently unafraid to break things. And I think you and I know that's a painful situation because we're investing time in building apps that use these APIs, and then they just change stuff that breaks our code. That's the way it is, and it's really annoying. Personally, I'm hoping that now that Microsoft is more in the driver's seat in some ways with OpenAI, they'll be more reasonable about this. So that's, again, comes back to where we see Azure OpenAI seems to be taking a more conservative, slower, more calculated approach in this development, whereas OpenAI is just gangbusters running as fast as they can. All right, let's get into some step-by-step. Assuming that your Azure subscription has access to OpenAI, the first step of the journey would be to create an instance of the service. So you can see if I search in the Azure portal at portal.azure.com, we've got Azure OpenAI, and we've got create, and we're off and running in the creation process. You could also use Bicep or ARM JSON if you want to do infrastructure as code. Now, to tie up that loose end, what if you don't currently have access in your subscription? What I'd advise you to do is go back to this docs article that I started with. What is OpenAI service? And if you go to how do I get access, there's a link to get on the waiting list. Hopefully you've got another inroad to Microsoft to shorten your wait. It's unfortunate it's like this, but this is just basically a Microsoft form. You'll need to provide your subscription ID, which you can get right from the portal. And eventually, fingers crossed, you'll be given access and you can start to use it. Now, the last time I checked, you had to get on another waiting list if you wanted to use GPT-4, the latest version of the model. What's involved in creating an Azure OpenAI service? It starts pretty common, I would think. You're choosing a subscription, you're choosing a resource group, a location, you're choosing a globally unique name for the service. Has to be globally unique. Pricing tier is just, there's just one right now. And that's something else I'm happy to discuss, the pricing. Remember those tokens? Every prompt gets broken into those tokens. That's what the format that the neural network expects. You're paying not only for the tokens that you get back from the AI, its response or its completion, but you're paying for your prompt as well. Now, normally, Microsoft and OpenAI give you about a 50% discount on the prompt, what you're paying there. Because look, that's what you're providing. You want the generative completion that comes back from the AI. But keeping in mind as a developer and as an architect, you want to think about that prompt engineering idea, how you can make your prompts as concise as possible, because the fewer the tokens, the less money you're going to have to pay. You see what I'm saying? All right, now that notion of responsible AI is something that Microsoft is really big about. You have to agree to use the service in conjunction with their policy. So that would be yet another, I'll assign that to you for homework. If you do a Google or Bing search for Azure Responsible AI or Microsoft Responsible AI, you can go to their Responsible AI website where they outline there's 6 pillars to their responsible AI strategy. Is it on this page? Figures, it's not. But you should familiarize yourself with those, because just by consenting to use the service, you're subject to those rules. In other words, they have a moderation API that looks at every prompt completion that goes through, and it will flag if it sees things like hate speech, the typical harmful type stuff. So it's important to be aware of that. Now, Azure OpenAI has, in my opinion, a number of huge advantages over going directly with OpenAI in terms of the Azure ecosystem, specifically a business that's concerned about security. And what business is not concerned about security? Where you're not trusting the vendor. Like if you want to fine tune your model and make it smart on your own data, you don't want to just upload those data files to OpenAI and have them disappear and you're wondering where they are, what are they doing, that kind of thing. And also with OpenAI, you're always going over the internet. You're HTTPS, but you don't have an off-internet private way to interact with those endpoints. That's something that's been around in Azure for at least a couple years now, the private endpoint service. So this is a huge advantage. The fact that instead of the default, which is where your Azure OpenAI service sits on the internet, you can entirely turn off ingress from the internet. And as long as you have a way into your Azure virtual network space, you can communicate bidirectionally with your Azure OpenAI service entirely off internet using private IP addresses. So that's going to require some infrastructure. You're going to need to have a way to get into the Azure VNet space. And you're also going to need to create a private endpoint for the Azure OpenAI service. But that's pretty good. There is actually a midway point that Microsoft calls a service endpoint. And that allows you in some ways to have the best of both worlds, where as long as you're connecting to Azure OpenAI from a particular subnet on a particular virtual network, you can communicate with it privately. Everybody else, you can still go over the internet, but you have a resource firewall where you can create an IP access list. So there's lots of flexibility that OpenAI just can't compete with because they're still really a startup, whereas Microsoft is a dinosaur. They've been around seemingly forever now. All right, then we apply our taxonomic tags and then away you go. So creating the Azure AI service is nothing that you haven't done a number of times before if you've done any deployment in Azure Resource Manager. Things start to get more interesting when we go within the service. So here we see my service instance. We've got our Azure Resource Manager control plane tools over here. Another big advantage that Microsoft offers when you use Azure AI services is you have control over your data encryption key. Remember, that notion is you're going to take an off-the-shelf instance of, say, GPT-3.5 or GPT-4, and you're probably going to want to fine-tune it against your own line of business data to make it smart on your domain. Well, those files have to come to the service. You have to upload them and submit them to an endpoint. With Azure, you've got control over that whole life cycle. Because number one, right within the OpenAI service, you can, instead of trusting Microsoft with the at-rest keys, you can do a customer managed key. Keep the key, say, in Azure Key Vault, configure the key for rotation, whatever. I mean, you've got a lot more control than you do over on the OpenAI side, it seems to me. And that also would go with fine tuning, because you could, for example, upload all of your source data into blob storage in Azure Storage. And there in Azure Storage, you have the ability, if you want to do customer managed keys. Yet another thing that comes off the top of my head that Azure offers that OpenAI doesn't is role-based access control. OpenAI has some very basic team controls. I can compare and contrast if you're interested. I wonder if I've got my Google account still cached. I think I do. But it's pretty basic over here. Over at platform.openai.com, you sign in with your account and you create an organization. And you then can join another organization. So you can centralize user accounts to a degree. But it's just I mean, there's just not enough there. There's not enough people at OpenAI to make this anywhere near what you have with Azure Resource Manager. You know what I mean? So back to OpenAI, let's take a look and see if there's any built-in roles. There's a couple anyway. So it looks like we've got a built-in role called Cognitive Services OpenAI Contributor that would give a person or an identity full access to the service. It's like contributor in Azure. It's basically full read-write. So we could delegate somebody the ability to manage the Azure AI service, this instance anyway, using a single role assignment. And then there's a basic Cognitive Services OpenAI user that can view files, models, and deployments and call inference operations. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm thinking they can interact with the models, but you'd want to test that to make sure. So it's a similar paradigm to what we see elsewhere in Azure Resource Manager, where you've got that owner, contributor, user, reader paradigm. And of course, there's nothing to stop you from creating your own custom RBAC roles. Keys and endpoint, yes, because OpenAI is a pure garden variety RESTful application programming interface. You can work with Azure OpenAI using Postman or curl if you want to, because ultimately it boils down to an HTTP request that's authenticated with a key, with an API key, and also includes header information and so on, like any REST call. So the same rules apply here in your Azure OpenAI service as any other data service. You want to protect those keys, and we've already got in Azure. We've got Key Vault. We've got the capacity to automate rotating and regenerating the keys. If we compare that with OpenAI, again, it's very basic. A developer can create new secret keys for whatever their use case might be. That deal where you see the plain text once and then you don't see it again. I mean, all that's standard fare as far as API keys go. But notice that there's really nothing else that the dev can do. And I'm trying to think, if I have multiple users in here, I'm not sure I can see everybody's key. So again, there's a big delta or a big difference there in terms of what an enterprise would expect on this kind of stuff and what's available just out of the box on the OpenAI side. Now, I hope I don't come across snarky or negative, because I really love OpenAI services. I actually personally, I prefer it because I like all the toys there. There's more toys to play with than there is in Azure right now in this domain. But it's just I want to deliver that value to you. You know, that's my goal as your instructor today. I want to give you this feedback, this candid feedback. So there we see again, I think I've said enough for now. Let me look at the time. Yeah, on the control plane. Let's start to get into the models and completions and a little bit deeper. The way this works architecturally in Azure OpenAI service is that your service then contains n number of deployments. And a deployment is an instance of the GPT model. Simple as that. And if you've used other Azure data services like Azure Databricks or Synapse Analytics or Data Factory, they all have a separate studio. Well, we have a similar idea here. If we click Manage Deployments, it's going to kick us out to a different DNS name. Instead of portal.azure.com, it's going to take us to oai.azure.com. So this would be a site to bookmark. And this is going to be where the actual practitioners and developers who are doing work with the models can come to do the fine tuning, to create embeddings, just to do the work with the models. And the playground is here as well. So let's take a look a step at a time what we've got in the studio here. If you've worked with the Azure Machine Learning Studio or Data Factory, it's a very similar UI. We can customize this for the user. You know, it's got some personalization, per user personalization. And it's divided up here on the global navigation bar. This is just your general welcome, and it's got some useful try it now and help links and that kind of stuff in it. There's separate playgrounds for chat completions and the DALL-E image generator. I'm not sure why they did it that way, but they did it. And there's some differences there that I want to make you aware of. Here we have our management tools for our model deployments. We can see our available models. Remember, I mentioned that you may have to get on another waiting list to see GPT-4. I've been on that waiting list for a long time, and I still don't have it. So I'm stuck with GPT-3.5. Now, in terms of what you'd want to use, the guidance that I offer is GPT-3.5 is the older version of the model. It's fast. It's faster than GPT-4, but it's quite a bit less robust or less intelligent than GPT-4 or GPT-4 Turbo. I mean, noticeably so. That said, because GPT-3.5 Turbo is so fast and inexpensive compared to GPT-4, I advise starting with it, seeing if it meets your use case. Because why would you want to overpay if you don't need to? You know what I'm saying? So don't just rule out GPT-3.5 because it's the older model. And you'll notice that these models are periodically snapshotted or versioned. 6, 13. OpenAI and Microsoft, sometimes they try to keep on the same page with their terminology, but sometimes it'll shift a bit. And it's just one of those little minor annoyances that gets under my skin. I think this means, does that mean June 13th of this year? I've had it on my to research list to figure out exactly. It deals with the time date stamp of when they've released another base model. You see, OpenAI is fine tuning their models continually and bringing its knowledge limit farther and farther forward. And you may find in your development that your app works great on one snapshot, but then if you decide to go to a more recent snapshot, it doesn't behave the same. So it's nice that both OpenAI and Microsoft allow you to choose specifically not just which base model and version you want, but the snapshot you can roll back to another snapshot. And you can, you can really create your own snapshots as such, because this models list, these are just the base off the shelf models. The idea is that your business is going to take these base models and customize them and make them smart in your domain's information as well. And you will continue to fine tune and refine those customized models as well. So this is what's available to us, the out of box. I want to say just a little bit about context length. You notice here we've got GPT-3.5 Turbo and GPT-3.5 Turbo 16K. The idea with this is you've got, it's basically a memory, because when you're using the chat endpoint with GPT, one of its core features is it remembers past things that you've said, prompts, and past responses or completions that the AI gave back to you. So it allows you to, in a sense, preserve the conversation state. But eventually that number of tokens gets bigger and bigger. In JSON, it's represented as a messages array. It's really, the statefulness is very low tech. All it is every time you get a response back from the AI, you append that to your messages array, and then you've got a new submission. You can see that in the JSON under the hood, what's going on. But eventually, if your conversation takes enough turns, you're going to reach the limit, whether it's 4,000 tokens or 8,000 tokens or 16. It's up to, I think, 128K now with GPT-4 Turbo. But eventually, when you reach the end of that, in order for the AI and you to keep that context flowing, the earliest entries are going to drop off the context, and then new entries are going to take its place, which can be annoying if you're using, say, Gemini and Google Bard. They're not as clear about context length. I find that I just remind the AI from time to time to make sure it doesn't forget the core of what I want it to do. But the longer context lengths not only give end users a longer, more robust conversation, but it allows us in business to do bigger jobs at bigger scale, like bigger document summaries and translations and that kind of stuff. So context matters, but at the same time, you don't want to just go to a supersized context if you don't need it. So it's the rule of parsimony here, where we're starting small. How well does this fit our use case? And then only go up from there if we need to. Okay, if we go into deployments, this is where, as I said, you can take these off-the-shelf models and create a new instance. Or if you have a customized model, a fine-tuned model, you can actually spin a deployment off of it, to my earlier point about snapshotting. When you create a new deployment in the Azure OpenAI service, you choose either a base model or a fine-tuned model that you've built. You can choose how you want versioning to handle, and this is pretty cool. I don't see this over on the OpenAI side. As new versions or snapshots of the base model get released by Microsoft, you can configure that your model gets auto-updated. But again, I'd be a little careful on that, because if you've been banging on GPT like I have over the last year or so, sometimes day to day, you can find the behavior of the published model to be variable. So you may want to pin to a particular version, totally up to you. And then you give it a name. I'll call this, and then I'll do Azure. Can you model? Advanced options. Okay, content filter, right. Again, both Microsoft and OpenAI have their own internal moderation API where they scan, they're looking for things like hate speech and violence and illegal stuff that'll flag use that goes outside of the terms of use in Azure OpenAI. But you can also, and it's down here under content filters, you can customize the moderation API to make it better a fit for your organization, you know? And I'll show you that as well as we continue this tour. I'm gonna just do a create here, and it's just like that. Creates a new instance of this huge GPT model that has been constantly running in the background in Azure data centers for I don't know how many years. To basically, if you don't know this, the short story is over the last, I don't even know how many years, I would say at least 5, the GPT bot, which is an internet search spider, much like Bing or Google and that, has been scouring all across the public internet, not attempting to go into anybody's private stuff, going across all of the GitHub and GitLab and Bitbucket public repositories and vacuuming up all that source code, languages around the world, cultures, websites. If it's on the public internet, it's eventually, I guess, going to be spidered and indexed by the GPT bot. Now, you might have heard that expression, sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. That seems to be what OpenAI did. Nowadays, you can disallow the GPT bot. On OpenAI side, they're not, Microsoft isn't clear about what's going on in terms of the models. Like, does Azure just get models from OpenAI, or are they doing anything in terms of spidering? None of that is in the open source, so we don't know. We can only speculate. But I know that GPT has in their docs, it's just adding an entry to your robots.txt file that we've been doing since the 90s, and you can block the GPT bot if you want to opt out your public website from being spidered by GPT and added into its model. But it's a big model, and it's amazing that you can create your own copy of it so quickly. All right, if we go into a deployment, this kind of kicks us into the playground interface. So we can see over here on the playground, we can choose between chat, completions, and DALL-E. We have a similar playground, one that I actually find to be a lot more usable over on the OpenAI side. It's platform.openai.com/playground. And the idea here is you can experiment against either an off-the-shelf model or one that you've fine-tuned. And you can experiment. I don't want assistance. That's something else that OpenAI has that's, I can't imagine when it's going to show up on Azure land. But again, this gap, I just want to make that totally clear, that if you're looking at adopting Azure OpenAI, expect to be a slow walker and a careful walker, which I think is smart and wise, that you're not going to have that agility at this point that we have on the OpenAI side specifically. But we can put in our prompts, you can go system prompt, user prompt, and you can tweak the main properties that you use to throttle and control the behavior of the AI. We're talking about properties like temperature and maximum length and stop sequences. Those are available over here in the Azure OpenAI land as well. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm a developer. Why am I in a graphical interface? The playground can be really useful, especially for the prompting, just as far as doing quick checks to tweak prompts. And another thing that you have here in this playground that you don't have on the OpenAI side, if I scroll down to the bottom, you can see your input token progress indicator. So based on the context length of the model, GPT-3.5 has a maximum memory or context of 4,000 tokens. And a token is considered about 4 characters of text. It's not necessarily a word, it's a word fragment. So it can be challenging sometimes to figure out what constitutes a token. OpenAI has a tokenizer application that can be a little bit helpful, platform.openai.com/tokenizer. And that allows you to put in some text here. And we can see how that's tokenized. And here it looks, it's basically one per word, but then again, these are short words. If you start throwing in source code in here, like if I were to throw in some Python or YAML with indents and stuff, a lot of times those indents get counted as tokens. So again, as a developer, I want to think about how can I minify my prompt in my source code in my application so that I'm not burning unnecessary tokens, because you're paying for those, remember. Okay. What else do we have here? So like I said, I don't particularly care for this interface. I find it really confusing. It's I don't want to get too far into editorializing. That's not what this is about. Let me see if I can use a template. JSON formatter, Xbox customer support. I'm just going to choose one of these. Okay. So long story short, I know that time, like anything, we could go for hours or days with this stuff. And I'd be happy, by the way, if you ever have an event, the Azure Kenya Azure Users Group, I'd be happy to do a longer workshop on any of this kind of stuff and beyond. Prompt engineering in particular is important. And the prompt is really just one text string, but it's interpreted by the AI in two ways. That's why when I'm doing a prompt, I'm going to literally do in my source code, system : blah, user : blah. I want to be as explicit as possible and not let the AI have to infer what is the system message, what is the user message. You see, if you get down to the JSON level and you're looking under the hood, GPT does, in fact, characterize and separate in your prompt. Okay, this is your system prompt. So this is where you're setting the context and you're giving me instructions on what you want me to do, how you want me to behave, what assumptions I should make about you, blah, blah, blah. That's the system part of the prompt. The user part of the prompt is where you're actually asking the question or you're giving the AI a specific task to do. And those are actually tracked in the JSON separately. There's three roles. There's system, user, and assistant. So in this example, the system message is you're the AI as an Xbox customer support agent. The user prompt is how much is a PS5? That's a funny question, being a Sony product, not a Microsoft one. And then we have, I guess, is that a sample completion? Or that's an example, I think. Again, when you start to get into this notion of prompt engineering, it's one of those annoyances. Because we're early days, you can ask 5 people for what prompt engineering is, and you'll get 8 definitions, You hear things like zero-shot prompting, chain of thought prompting. I just translate those very casually into one shot or few shot. I'm just giving the AI examples on how I want it to give me the goods, give me the completion. That's all it is. One example, one shot, 2 or 3 examples, few shot. No, not more complicated than that. Chain of thought would be in my system message. You can tell the model, you think in a stepwise or a step-by-step manner. You'd give some indication that you want the AI to reason. And that way, they break down the problem and it can help you break down the problem better. And you can reason, especially if you're doing a chat, a turn-based chat, you can solve the problem in a more procedural way. So anyway, it ultimately comes down to submitting it. I'm going to send a new query in. I'm going to say something like, how much RAM does the Xbox Series X have? And I'm going to send that. Now, this is a real prompt going to the real API. So I'm paying for this in my Azure subscription. That's something to keep in mind about these playgrounds. And there's my response. Now, this is all coming back formatted because this is a front-end application. But we can see the raw JSON right here. And let's take a quick look at that. Let me zoom in a little bit. So here's our role system where we've got our system prompt. And here's our role user. And I'd strongly recommend you use this syntax in your application. So, because to me, the core, the actual distilled core of prompt engineering is reducing the number of assumptions that GPT needs to make. Say, teach me how to use a for loop in Python. It's going to teach you how to use it, hopefully. But will that response be tailored to you as a beginner? No, probably not. But if you say, I'm a newbie, I don't know what I'm doing here, you're going to get a much different response. You see, every word counts. So here's the original user prompt. Again, notice that the previous responses are being appended to this array. And that is your context or your memory in that conversation. And again, you need to do that as a developer. It's just, working with JSON. It's done for you automatically here because this is a front-end application. But we get down, this is just showing us, I guess, the prompt in JSON. We can also view the source code. This is useful, and actually it's what I wanted to wind up with, the more programmery, what do I need to do kind of stuff. Here we can go view code, and it'll show us, because this is Microsoft, we've got an option for C#. You can do this same thing at the OpenAI, platform.openai.com site, but there's no C#. There's Python and JavaScript. By the way, the libraries, let me go over to OpenAI and let me go into the documentation and let me find their article on libraries. Here's the issue. I want to make this hopefully crystal clear. OpenAI maintains two official libraries, one for Python and another for Node, all right? You're going to have the best experience in Python. So that's my recommendation. Unless you're forced to use another language or framework, Python's going to be your easiest lift. And then there's the Node library as well. Now, for our purpose, Microsoft Azure maintains libraries that are compatible. So the idea here is that Microsoft publishes their OpenAI client libraries for .NET, JavaScript, Java, and Go that are cross-compatible with OpenAI and Azure. That's important if you're using both, if you plan a migration from one to the other. So that's good news. Want to make sure you know that. There's also, as you would expect, a bunch of community libraries that may or may not work with Azure OpenAI. The standard rules apply when you're using a community repository. But one last thing I'll say is that the official Python library out of box has support for both Azure and OpenAI in it. That's my favorite thing. I like Python. So to look at the code, again, we want to remember that when you're dealing with sending requests into the OpenAI service or Azure OpenAI service, you're just making an HTTP request. So here we're seeing an example in Python, and we're setting up the connection, creating some variables. Now, some of the specifics here are going to be a little bit different. For instance, in Azure, you have to specify an API version. You don't have to do that in OpenAI, but basically it's the same. You've got your endpoint. This is your service endpoint. You're going to need your key. Remember those keys? And the standard rules apply there. You never want to put a key in plain text, so you can use in Python, you can have an environment variable called, for example, OpenAI API key, and you can fetch that variable from memory to keep it safe. And then we have our list of messages that you'll want to append if you do, in fact, want to do a multi-turn conversation. That's an array of JSON objects that consist of these role system, role user, role assistant groupings. And then after the messages array, it's basically a call. You're building your client, your chat client, and you're building out your connection here. So we're creating a completion here that goes to OpenAI, chat completion, create. You're specifying which model, and then a comma-separated list of your properties. Temperature, for instance, controls the degree of deterministic versus randomness to the reply. Max tokens allows you to throttle how much text you get back from the service. But you should understand that max tokens incorporates not just the completion that comes back from the service, but also your prompt. So if you're dealing with a 4,000 token context and your prompt is 1,000 tokens, that means that you've only got 3,000 left. By contrast, if in your application you want the prompt to be just one paragraph, you can cut down the max tokens, you can add a stop phrase. There's a few techniques in here, and more were actually added by OpenAI during their conference a couple weeks ago, where you can put flags, it's called a seed property, in your request, and you can tag your prompt so that it gets, OpenAI doesn't guarantee it's the exact same response for the same prompt, but they guarantee it's going to be mostly the same prompt, because that's a common issue. Let's say your line of business application is crafted to send the exact same prompt up. You've got user A, user B. They hit the button, they send the exact same prompt up. They're going to get slightly different responses by the nature of generative AI models. They're generating token by token, moment by moment, the best next word fragment to add to that completion. It's amazing it can do it as fast as it can. So that, again, that seed property is something else that's available for use on the OpenAI side now, but we're going to have some waiting to do. So if I were committed to Azure OpenAI, I would absolutely maintain an OpenAI account, and I would be experimenting and staying up to date on everything that's happening over here, and then rejoice if and when it surfaces over here into Azure OpenAI Studio. Now, a little tiny bit about this notion of chat versus completions. Hopefully chat makes sense. It's got the conversation history. It's got the chattiness to it. Hey, I'll help you, that kind of thing. Completions is actually deprecated over on the OpenAI side. That is just where you send in your prompt and you get just the response back from the AI, but there's no cruft or chrome or framing. There's no, hey, how you doing? There's no history. It's not intended for a turn by turn. What OpenAI decided is to put everything into the chat endpoint. If you want to use it as a completion endpoint, you can by tuning parameters, but they deprecated completions. I don't know why it's still here on the Azure side, other than maybe Microsoft has some high priority customers who are invested in it. Who knows? Again, a sticky wicket here is the fact that we're messing with open and closed source technologies. OpenAI has for-profit and non-for-profit wings that sometimes clash, let's face it. OpenAI does have some open source stuff at GitHub, but GPT is their ticket. It's their secret. So it's a proprietary trade secret. Microsoft is using the model. They know how it works. They know how the proverbial sausage is made, but it's proprietary and closed source, and it's competing with Google, with Gemini, with Amazon, Meta, all of those competitors that are also building multimodal Gen AI systems. They don't have the 9 months head start that OpenAI did, though. All right, so wrapping things up because we're coming closer to the 45-minute mark. Trying to think if there's anything before I come over and answer all your questions. As far as the fine tuning, what that means is you're uploading data. You're going to have to prepare your data. That's another whole conversation. But you're basically expanding the scope of your GPT model. You've got your own custom GPT, and in addition to being smart on the public internet, it also has your internal development guidelines, all of your internal source code, maybe your customer service docs, and it's able to respond intelligently in that domain as well. There's something related to fine-tuning called embeddings. Fine-tuning and embeddings are related, but they're different in many ways, really. Embeddings is a common use case for that, which I think you can do in here. I'm not 100% positive. But embeddings are useful when you're creating things like a semantic search engine for your application. It can take your source data, which again, you have to prepare the data and put it into a certain way, but it can create that embedding, as it's called, that constellation of tokens on your line of business data. And the embeddings are used to customize how the AI responds. So if you've got a customer service chatbot, you can create an embedding that has all of your past tickets and conversations that your live agents might have had, and it can sculpt and shape the way that the AI gives its responses. Fine-tuning is kind of like that, but fine-tuning increases the overall intelligence of the model as opposed to like more granularly looking at how do we search really fast to get not only, say, a certain bit of information, but relatedness. If you're doing e-commerce and you want to do a recommendation engine, an embedding would be great for that because all your products will be in this constellation and they'll be mapped such that, oh, if you bought product X, you probably want to see product. We see that every day, don't we? Open up Amazon. Whew, I think I've been talking nonstop for almost 45 minutes now. Let me take a pause. Charlene, any questions that from the chat or elsewhere that you'd like to surface?
Yes, let me just go to the first question.
Okay.
So the first question is, how does Azure OpenAI service complement the already existing Azure Cognitive services? Are there any use cases that they can be used together?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me open up another browser tab. We can see if we go back in the Azure portal to the Azure OpenAI blade, notice that Microsoft placed Azure OpenAI right next to their cognitive services. So we're looking at, no question about it, some overlap. But I think it's more constructive to look at how we can, to the questioner's point, blend them together. And we absolutely can. If you don't know what a cognitive service is, these are pre-trained machine learning models that they're smart, they've been mature, they've been around forever, that you can consume as a service in your applications. So for instance, computer vision and custom vision are great for object detection in images and in movies. You can even train the model to a certain degree, even though these are basically off-the-shelf pre-trained models, but they are pre-trained to a specific domain. And you can even use Azure Bot Service to create intelligent chatbots, but nowhere near as intelligent as OpenAI. So here we go. Now we have as an alternative OpenAI. What we're seeing, or what I've noticed, is that Microsoft is gradually infiltrating GPT into all of their products. You saw Windows with MS Paint. We've got GitHub Copilot. We've got Azure Copilot, which is something I haven't tested yet. I'm going to want to do that tonight. Let me write that down. Azure Copilot, test it out. I'll do that tonight. What we're seeing, or what I've observed with the COG services, I don't know about like the specific COG services yet. That would be worth going to their docs pages. There's going to be some kind of integration. But specifically, I know that with Azure Bot Service, and even more specifically in the Power Platform, there's the Power Virtual Agent Service. I know that that's active now, to where you can make your chatbots much more intelligent by connecting them to GPT. I mean, historically, when you're doing COG services, you take what they give you, and there's some ability to customize. And when you're creating a bot, you're pretty much doing it yourself, unfortunately. So the OpenAI service dramatically changes the landscape. So in summary, think of cognitive services and OpenAI as collaborative partners with some overlap, but you can absolutely blend them to better effect.
All right. Albert, do you feel like your question was well answered? Thank you. All right, so on the next question, what are the different ways to interact with the service? For example, REST APIs, SDKs, web interface.
Right, all of the above. I showed a web interface in terms of the playgrounds, but you absolutely could build your own front end. I mean, a lot of people in the Visual Studio code space are building extensions as a way to interface with these APIs, specifically with OpenAI. But we can do it here. Sure, there's a OpenAI or Azure OpenAI REST API. There's going to be, here it is right here, Azure OpenAI Service REST API reference. So it's going to go through and walk you through what's expected. Now, to that point, if you're willing to go over on the OpenAI side too, if for no other reason to just get more experience and context, and frankly, you might not have access to Azure OpenAI, there's a couple really useful sites for this very thing on the OpenAI side that I want to draw your attention to. One is the OpenAI Postman collection. You probably, if you search the Postman gallery, somebody might have created a similar collection for Azure OpenAI, but this is, you can clone this collection, this request collection into your Postman account. And again, if you don't know, Postman is a software as a service app that runs anywhere, cross-platform, etc., where you can work with REST APIs. So this is a collection of completions against all the different services within OpenAI, but I would focus on the chat one. And you could actually, once you clone this, you can pop in your own API key and get off and running. You know what I'm saying? Just look at platform.openai. There's the API reference right there. So you can go from the ground floor using, say, curl or Postman to craft those HTTP requests manually if you want to start at the very ground floor. I already showed you the libraries, Microsoft has client libraries for C# and Java and JavaScript and so on. If you're comfortable with Python or Node, I would use the OpenAI libraries because they're cross-compatible. So that covers that. I think that covers it all. You've got REST API Direct, you've got using a library or SDK, and you've got web access. There you have it. But ultimately, remember, it comes down to an HTTPS request with headers and stuff on it, with your payload, with your JSON that's your prompt and so forth. And you've got your API key there to validate or to authenticate and authorize that request. Everything else is just an abstraction on top. I hope that was helpful.
It was, thank you. The next question is, how can I monitor and manage my Azure OpenAI service resources? For example, usage metrics, cost monitoring. Like, is the monitoring done the same way as the rest of the services, or a different way?
Right. Let me again get back to the Azure portal here. It's the same way. That again is another tick on the side of Azure OpenAI, that we have access to the Azure Monitor and Log Analytics platform. So let's go into my service instance, and if just like we would for any other Azure resource, we can create alerts that when our spend reaches a certain threshold, you know how Azure alerts work. You can have them wired up to event occurrences or metric thresholds to notify and even run code in response to those alerts firing. We can just plot metrics on a chart that look at our utilization. Let's see right out at the box, OpenAI request. We've got latency, active tokens. So these are all built right into the service that you can leverage and create alerts on. Normally, I would advise in your deployment script, in your bicep template, when you create your OpenAI service, do your diagnostic settings there to get them out of the way and to make sure that you're sending your OpenAI data, your log data and your metric data into your log analytics workspace. So I can create a diagnostic setting here. And what does it give us here? All metrics, that's kind of generic, but that's your time sampled stuff that we saw on the Metrics Explorer a moment ago. And then as far as log, we would just choose what categories we want, and then we can send it to any of these destinations, which are the same destinations that any Azure resource can be configured for. I would recommend that you use log analytics because that's really the way to do your application monitoring, your infrastructure monitoring, and your security monitoring using the Kusto query language. One more tip I have to that point is once you've done all this, you're going to want to get smart on how to use the Kusto query language. And one site, educational site that's used internally at Microsoft a lot is kustoking.com, Kusto. This is just a private, I think a Microsoft MVP created this. But you can just come in here and start at ground level, start at level 100 and go through the tutorials to learn the query language. And that language is used as a log search language, not just within Azure and OpenAI, but as you can see on the screen, across the entire Microsoft Cloud platform. So it seems to me that working in Azure requires proficiency with using Kusto so that you can do quality monitoring.
All right, thank you for that. What are the deployment options for Azure OpenAI service? For example, is it specific to regions? Can you have it on the edge? Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, like all Azure services, when the engineering teams behind a service have it ready for at least public preview, they're going to do a staged deployment where they only go to a couple regions, and then gradually, it's safe deployment practice or SDP. They'll spread it out. Now, as of today, let's quickly check. If we go into the Azure OpenAI Blade and go to create, let's take a look here. That's a lot more regions than I thought would be here, to be honest. So it looks like as of today, December 13th of 2023, this is what we're dealing with. I mean, that's not a whole lot, to be honest with you, but it's to be expected given that it's so new still. It's amazing that the teams were able to put this out in the speed that they did. So I would say that this list will gradually expand, but this again could pose a problem. It just struck me now for businesses that whose compliance requirements are such that we have to be in our region and it's not supported. Over on the OpenAI side, now behind the scenes, Microsoft is hosting all of their infrastructure in Azure, but you don't get to choose a region. You don't know really what region. And again, that could present issues for businesses that are heavily subjected to compliance requirements and regulations too. I guess the theme is we're early days on this. It reminds me of the early days of the World Wide Web in the mid-90s. This is a big paradigm shift that's happening with generative AI, and we're on the early days. So I'm especially grateful that we're all here together learning about this, because this is going to serve us all really well going forward.
All right, thank you for that, Tim. Just a request before I let some comment or ask a question. So someone has said you can kindly share the link to I think to the KQL platform, the Kustoking page. You can share it on the chat kindly, and any other documentation that you might have opened on your browser. It will be very helpful. Yeah. So Sam.
Okay. Thanks, Charlene, and thanks, Tim, for first of all for honoring the invite, and second for this informative presentation. For me, it has been sort of a jumpstart towards or an ignition of interest towards that side. And so I have two questions. One is with regards to what I put in the polls earlier. So from the look, we don't have a lot of people having access to the OpenAI service. So I don't know the dynamics of that. If you could elaborate further, like how can we increase our chances of just getting landing access to that platform? And then also, in terms of, I know you've shared a number of resources and there is a request already to share the links, but if you could just run through, for example, someone wants to enhance their skills in generative AI, especially on Azure now, what you started with the documentation, like what would be the good roadmap to that? Thank you.
Okay. Before I forget, let me dial up the appropriate site, then I'll put it in the chat. Okay, your first question, what can you do, if anything, to boost your chances of getting to farther along the line to get greenlit? You'd think, given that I was in the MVP program for a number of years and I was at Microsoft for a while, with all the contacts I have, I don't think I'm unique, special, or different, but I do have a large library of contacts. I've been waiting for months. I'm not sure what you can do unless you have a contact who's very high up the chain at Microsoft. You see, in their docs, if you go what I had read at the beginning of the session, that they're framing it that you have to get on the wait list so we can responsibly onboard. I'm sure that's true to a degree, but I think the truth of the matter is they're just flooded with requests and they don't have the capacity to handle if they made it open to everybody. It's a capacity issue. So in that sense, there's nothing any of us can do unless and until Microsoft builds out more compute in their data centers to support the capacity. So it's not a great answer. So I'd say get on the waiting list ASAP and then ask anybody and everyone who you think can help. If you've got a contact at Microsoft, just ask them if there's anything they could do. You want to go the professional networking route, get on LinkedIn and contact some of the engineering team members. They may or may not respond. Again, I'm sure they're all flooded. So that's how I'd answer that. The second, and I'm going to throw this link into the chat right now. I'm sorry I didn't do that earlier. I'm glad. Thanks for that call out. Microsoft Learn has a number of these free curated labs, and they've got a number of them now on Azure AI. This one that we're looking at is a specific model, but I want to go to the actual learning path. This is the path. Yeah, this is the link I should have shared. Let me put this, I'll call it Azure Open AI free training, because it's all free. The only thing that's not free is the Azure subscription. Microsoft does have some sandbox access in some of their free training, but it's expensive and it wouldn't be a good thing for AI because of the expense. But this is a pretty good starting point for sure. It's broken into modules, fundamentals of generative AI, where it walks through LLMs, large language models, OpenAI, a little bit on the Copilot ecosystem. And then we've got a model, or a module rather, directly on Azure OpenAI service. And then there's one on responsible. And you can just search and look for more in there. So that's curated directly from Microsoft. Another resource is the OpenAI, what the heck is it called? Cookbook, yes. It's not loading, there it is. This is the OpenAI Cookbook. And from what I understand, the OpenAI people use these projects in their demos with customers. This has a huge corpus of source code here, including a section on Azure. So I would go in here and start poking around, not just for the OpenAI specific projects, but the ones for Azure specifically. I mean, the ones that are for OpenAI, as long as it's available in Azure OpenAI, you should be able to just tweak and go. You know what I mean? But this is a really good set of examples. And then lastly, I know we're burning up time here. There's an equivalent source code repo for Azure OpenAI. Azure OpenAI, samples, GitHub. I'll try that as my search. Fingers crossed that this is it. I think this is it. Well, there's a few. I guess what I'll say to sum up is go over to GitHub and start, or just go to Google and start doing searches for things like Azure OpenAI tutorials, sample code, and make sure to add GitHub. Because what Microsoft is doing in all of their training stuff and their sample apps and stuff, they're putting them all in open GitHub repos, and they'll be under the Azure account. It's just a question of finding them. And there's a few for Azure OpenAI, unfortunately. Just look at what I've been doing is I'll dial up a repo and see how active it is. You see how this one's saying 3 months. This is probably not, that's not the one that I wanted to actually show. This is too old. They've got one that's being modified now, and you'll want to find the repo that has the most traction on it. It's somewhere in there. I'm sorry I don't have it offhand. If you want to follow up with me afterwards, certainly. I'll give it to you then. Speaking of which, there's my contact deets. I've got email tim-warner@pluralsight.com, and I'm at LinkedIn. I created a short link, as you can see right there, timw.info/li. Any questions in closing? I could do one more question.
No more questions on the chat. Anyone else with a question? I think we're good.
Okay. Well, I hope you all learned a lot. I love this technology, and I hope you do too. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for your time. Thank you so much for your great insights. I personally wish I had already requested for this service a long time ago, but I will just be patient on the waiting list so that I can explore all the models. I encourage everyone to reach out to Tim. He's already shared his contacts. If you have any further questions or you want to learn more about Azure OpenAI, he's free to take it up with you. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for your patience as well. Looking forward to see you on our next session. Thank you so much, Tim. All right. Hope you enjoy your evening, everyone. And Tim, I guess it's daytime on your side, so enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Hey, bye. Thank you.